I've always wanted to do this to a journalist. Geraldine Doogue, welcome to Farm Riders. It really is a pleasure to have you, and as Ben's introduction noted, you really are somebody who's been around journalism in Australia for a long time. So you've got lots of things you want to share. But earlier this year, you gave the Andrew Olley lecture, the memorial lecture for another revered ADC journalist. You titled your speech "Not Drowning, Waving." What did you mean?
Well, when they asked me to do this, well, Kim Williams, the chair, asked me to do it. You know, everything about journalism was grim. Everything I looked at was seriously grim, and I initially was going to use the great W.B. Yeats line, "Will the centre hold?" And then I thought, this is just this just sounds like we're, about ready to jump off the cliff. So I sort of decided to be a teeny bit witty if I sort of use the "not drowning, waving," because I do think we're hanging on in legacy media, which I think, we were just talking at the table, why I think the legacy media part of life still matters, though it's under huge challenge. So that was my effort, to sort of say, you're having trouble. To sort of say, hey, it is tough, because what I said in that lecture is that all the very good marker boys, shall we say, around the world show that a lot of people have left legacy media as a regular part of their life, and they're not missing it, but we're missing them. The journalists are sort of in grief, and the Reuters Institute's done some very good work on this. They say, people feel they're keeping up. They're not missing the journalism, which is a source of extraordinary upset to journalists, but that's where we are. So what do we do with that?
So digging into that, you note that a German, Matthias Dopfner, he believes, and quoting from your remarks, he believes one of the reasons people are losing trust in the media is because many reporters confuse journalism for activism, telling us what the world should look like and ignoring inconvenient news. Now, the world at the moment is full of, and we're seeing this in the United States, the irony of cancel culture and how it's being weaponized, has long been, now is being. How, as a professional journalist, as somebody who worked your craft now for a long time, how do you straddle that line between activism and journalism and making sure that you're keeping true to your craft?
Well, I don't think I don't feel I find it tough. You examine yourself as to whether you're kidding yourself and whether you do insert in all sorts of subtle ways things that, you feel very strongly about. I certainly feel that there's a whole younger strand who sort of say, why wouldn't you be activist if you're in journalism? I've met them, and they come in the door and they fundamentally believe that is the role that you play. And I feel that it's just a highway to unravelling ourselves if we lose the ability to see the difference between activism and journalism. And in fact, there are people whom I quote in that lecture, who are very sort of populist type people. There was a quote, I think, given to the man who runs the big German, organisation. Somebody brought him a detail about a survey that was done of American high-ranking university talent, and a lot of them said they wanted to get into journalism, and they took it to this man. Other journalists took it to this man who runs I've just forgotten what group it is, the German group that I he's he's a big German guy, and they said, "Isn't this fabulous that you're the best and the brightest want to join journalism?" He said, "No, it's not, because I'm convinced that a lot of those people believe they're in there to effectively be politicians or activists, and that will destroy journalism. I'm not interested in attracting necessarily those people if they've got that sort of deluded view." Now, that is a very interesting sort of debate inside journalism. The other one that intrigues me is investigative journalism. Everybody wants to be an investigative journalist. And I accept, and I took a bit of a risk in that lecture, because I knew there were people sitting in front of me who'd done marvellous investigative journalism, to say, I don't think investigative journalism necessarily persuades people to keep up their subscription levels to legacy media. It may well be a more libertarian, communitarian approach where we clearly serve people's perceived needs, then we've got to work out what they are, so that we don't look as though we're serving ourselves. It's sort of got to be quite palpably that we're there for others. But all of this is so full of debate, and we've got to have the guts to have those debates.
So, again, influenced by the United States, we keep hearing all the talk of fake news. And journalism and activism, mainstream media versus, and we were having a conversation. I'm not going to quote what you've got in front of you there, the idea that people are now choosing the direction of the news they want to take. So I asked you this when we spoke earlier in the week, and it's been the number one question I had jotted down when I knew I was having this conversation with you. From a journalist perspective, what is truth? Because that sits at the heart of so much of the profession of journalism. Your role at telling a story, but what is the truth, and how do we navigate that in a time when people aren't sure what it is?
Well, I suppose I feel that we certainly the notion of a sort of a collective we that has essentially a story that people can vary from, but there's essentially a singular story. I just think at the moment that's not there. We just moved to a broader group, to a broader debate, although there's a lot of noise around as everybody finds their own voice, because that's what social media has done. It's democratized the business of finding your own voice, where it used to be governed by gatekeepers. I was attracted into the journalism by my marvellous Uncle John, who was a deputy chief sub-editor at the West, and he was a very fine man. We were talking about earlier, he went into journalism training actually, and he was a modest man, a very intelligent man, but he believed in the role of gatekeeping as a sort of a moderating factor to come out with a more or less unitary point of view, which you were free to debate from, but there was a unitary point of view. Well, I mean, Rupert Murdoch's just scuttled that with Fox News, That's, Rupert says, it's just governed his recent decisions. We can't go back to that. This is his view. I'm not so sure I agree, because I think we've got this incredible proliferation of noise with no one distilling and curating what purports to be something like truth. I mean, I don't know how you define truth. I certainly think you can give people explainers of different versions of the truth. I mean, that's what I think is really coming through now in journalism, the need for clever, sparkling, well-done explainers. One of the other very interesting developments, it is pertinent to what you asked me, is the rise of podcasting, where everybody's got their own little sort of outlet. In fact, what I was going to quote was from today's Fin Review, their power issue, and they're looking at the podcast influencers, and they quote Kelly O'Dwyer, who's the former Liberal minister, and she comes out with this devastating line: "What you can do is choose your own echo chamber." That's what she says is the outcome of where we are now. And I thought, wow. Is that right? Is that what we're all doing? Choosing our own echo chamber in order to get our own version of the truth. But if you look at, say, podcasts like If You're Listening, which is Matt Bevan, his numbers are just going like that in terms of people listening. Our numbers for global roaming are going like that. I mean, they're very good too, but his are off the charts. In fact, it's extraordinary how well he's doing. So I would argue that he does it in a sparkling fashion. I think he basically sort of says, I invite you, I'm bringing you this. If you listen to Matt Bevan, I'm bringing you this. You go away and keep thinking. Now, I think that's not a bad way to approach the notion of the truth.
I have to say, I have listened to a lot of the work that Matt does, and as a consumer of news, somebody who's been a consumer of news for a long time, having been given the opportunity to go away and draw my own conclusion rather than having it drawn for me is a really is important. And I sort of scribbled down this before. Media generally ranks low in trust. So, it's sort of down there with politicians and used car salesmen, unfortunately. And curiously, it's the media owners rather than the professionals in it, but that's a different issue. So rather than seek to restore trust, which is often what we seek to, people say, we're low, we've got to get it back. What should be done to build greater connection between the media industry and the consumers of media?
Well, I mean, this is something, we're just utterly preoccupied by, and we're constantly, I think it's a real dilemma, because we're constantly told, say at the ABC, know your audience. Well, of course, who can argue with that? But I thought the whole idea, particularly of a public broadcaster where you're publicly funded, is that, and it was the old Lord Reithian idea, that you try to stretch your audience, you try to curate what they may not have had time to catch up with. Now, can they tell you what it is that they haven't caught up with? I don't think so. But that's the classic, what you're told when you're, got to ask them, they know what they want. Well, do they? So it's not a case of going in there and imposing, but I think that's the job of the well-trained professional, is to say, okay, now what is going on that is not fully understood? How do we make it understandable? Which is a curation process. I think curation's a very good word. We're used to that with museum curators and artists. We haven't used it in journalism, so it's a sort of a new development. And I use it with a whole bunch of young journalists who was on a webinar at the ABC the other day, and two of them said, "Oh, I like that word. I haven't thought of that word before." And because it implies judgment, but it implies skilled judgment, informed judgment. And then I hope you distill it in a way that you tell the story well. But that's the difference. And like these days, I sit there on Global Roaming with Hamish MacDonald, and we know that one of the big factors is news aversion, because people are so overwhelmed by the 24-hour news agenda. And this year in particular, 2025 is going to go down in history as one of the more remarkable years. There's so much unsolved. There's so much uncertainty. I can feel, if we come in every week and sort of say, in effect, what is Donald Trump doing this week? You can feel, people switching off all over the place, particularly women.
My boss was telling me yesterday, he said, I can't wait for the day when I don't wake up to listen to something but what's being said or done or otherwise by Donald Trump. So
Right.
I want to just change tack briefly to focus on the work we do at Farm Riders and talking to rural audiences. It's sometimes said that people who live beyond the cities don't have their voices heard. They find it very hard to have their perspective shared and understood. And we see that in the context of the climate change policy discussion, particularly around renewable energy and land use and other sorts of things, that people outside the cities feel that their perspectives aren't understood by people in town. As a journalist, how do you think communities like that can have their voice better heard? Is it through having a deeper presence in those communities by journalists, or is the way the story being shared into journalism, does the way we ask for the story to be told need to be adjusted?
I do think you could do better storytelling. I think that it just works a treat, I think, when you can present that almost you lead with the idea there's a fantastic story of a person here, and then you find a couple of legs down the race that you're onto people who are have got quite a political view. Now, that certainly happened to me, and clever people have come and said, this is a great story here, fantastic story of this family. And then you realise that they're actually deeply involved in some line, which is fine. It's just as, you just have to work it out. And I say to young people, that, like, what exactly is going on here, I used to get very frustrated during the way some people believed they sort of owned something like Radio National, and these were not people from the country. These were people, this particularly during asylum seekers debates and so on. they'd ring up and almost say, well, here I am ready to talk. And it used to really annoy me because a lot of people sort of seemed to me, some of my colleagues anyway, would say, oh, yes, righto, you can go at 8:10 sort of thing. Well, hang on. What? Oh, we've got to follow the story through. We've got to keep the story going. Now, I think that can be a real trap too, that idea that, you do every component little part, every visceral development, when I think it becomes very tedious. But I suppose I feel I suppose there is a sense that there are some parts of the media that I can see are claimed by people in rural areas who feel they've got a very definite link in with the media and their stories are very well heard, in my opinion. Yes, you may not agree, but I think, oh yeah, right, you're getting that story out very well indeed. But the whole social licence story, for instance, around wind at the moment, is, I think, really in the balance. And I'm going to watch you all as you think about how you engage in that story. You've got to be politically savvy, and yet I think stand back from the overt party politics so that you appear to be arguing for something bigger than just a particular party line, which I don't think actually necessarily rural people always do that well. You can take me on, you can argue with me, but that's how I tend to feel. Although if you look at, say, Australian Story, who I think certainly is ready to buy into rural people's storylines very well and does them in not just sympathetic, but I think the people emerge real and more than just their line that they're pushing, which is somehow, to me, what I think is the big challenge for rural people.
My last question before I hand over to some people who might have some more intelligent questions is, you've been around journalism for a very long time, and I haven't given you full notice of this one, so I hope I'm not. I hope you still talk to me afterwards. But what's been your greatest memory and achievement, do you think, in journalism over your years? Do you have a favourite story? Do you have a favourite achievement or professional accomplishment that you think is the thing that hopefully your time it doesn't come for some time, but you want that people will remember you for?
Look, setting up Life Matters was an incredible thrill. So that was a program that is still on the air. What is it? 26 years afterwards, I think. I came across from working. Norman Swan brought me to Radio National. I'd been working on Gulf War One, which we were talking about earlier, and we ran out of budget because it cost so much money to cover Gulf War One, and I had one of those moments where a good man who was in charge, Peter Manning, who was in charge of news and current affairs, said, "Well, what are you going to do now?" And I said, I thought I'd carry on as I would. He said, "No, it won't be. It won't be good enough to be a generalist. You'll have to choose a specialty." And I looked around. And I said, "Well, what is George Negus and Ray Martin and all of them? What are they doing? Aren't they doing generalist?" And he basically sort of said, "It won't be good enough for what you want, or you think that." The implication was, you won't make it. I thought, oh, right. So I'm sitting there thinking, oh, well, what do I do now? I haven't got myself a posse. And Norman, bless his cotton socks, approached me from Radio National and said, I want to set up this program that makes the domestic scene, broadly defined, much bigger in the Australian media space. It was sort of women's pages, and there was some fantastic stuff, but it was very niche. And he said, I want to make it bigger. Very big thinking, Norman. And my husband at the time, he was my husband, he died sadly. My late husband was trying to say, he said to me, oh, what are you going that for? That's a little ghetto. And I said, well, all I can tell you is all my friends are in that ghetto and I want to be there. And I moved to Life Matters and we made that a much bigger round. And to see people, different iterations come through, oh, that's immensely satisfying to do that and to be given that chance. Global roaming is a great I'd always wanted to make, after I'd done all those years on Life Matters, I then moved to Saturday Extra and set that up too. But I wanted to make foreign affairs as big as domestic politics, as a water cooler conversation, really. And I'd tried several times and no one was interested. And then at the end of 2023, all the stars aligned and we did it. So when you can start something, it's hard because you can feel people saying, what's she doing now? You know, where's she going? People don't like change. And takes a while, but that's been a great thrill.
So Geraldine has very kindly offered to take questions from the floor. So if you would raise your hand and introduce yourself. But Geraldine, I might start with one. As I was doing my little bit of research on you and saw the award for the coverage of the Gulf War, what was it like as a journalist to cover something like that? And how do you cover such a monumental, current event and remain able to tell the story and not get drawn into it?
Very, very hard to do precisely that. And I mean, I did war reporting to an extent when the Falklands War was on. And that's when I learned, that was a big shock, because you suddenly realise there are a lot of English people here. Suddenly you're into developing stories with hundreds dead and things happening. And of course, it's nothing like what's happening out in Gaza, if you know what I mean. So it's just a whole different, but that was my first experience. And then comes Gulf War I, which of course, looking back, was pretty easy, if you know what I mean, to cover. Except that was the beginning of 24-hour news, the CNN stuff. All of that started then. That didn't exist before then, really. So look, it was incredible. There's nothing like war to heighten people's sense of ownership of a spot in the news. And so what are we living through now? I mean, the Israelis made the decision. I'm not buying into the details of the war, please don't, I'm not going to. But the Israelis made the decision they weren't going to let general coverage into Gaza. I'm wondering whether that was a right decision now in terms of even their situation. Because I think that the coverage could be considerably broader than it is. But I mean, I think it has roiled lots of teams, certainly introduced challenges to our teams. And it's fearfully difficult to cover. Really at a level that you just don't cover. I mean, the only sort of vaguely similar, this is not even a good analogy, but the other big moment in my life I remember was September the 11th, which was actually September the 12th here. And it was on Life Matters, and we had a whole Wednesday talkback lined up on apprenticeships in Australia. And we had a very complex, lovely little program lined up, and I turned on the television. My stepson had rung me the night before and said something huge had happened. I thought, I turned over and went to sleep and woke up in the morning. I thought, oh, yes, right, the world has changed. And I rang my executive producer and said, I don't think anybody's going to want to talk about apprenticeships in Australia, do you? So we scuttled the whole thing. And I mean, it was one of those moments where, like, if you don't, you'll forgive me if I put it like this, if you don't enjoy those days, you shouldn't be in journalism. So we came in, everybody was ready to give us their absolute best. And we were all standing around, it's one of those days when you've got young people and you say, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do that. And everybody is happy and goes off and does their best work. And you put together this program that, like, it makes me go gooey to think about it. It was a marvellous program about a terrible, terrible day when it's all unfolding before your very eyes. Now, they're great moments, but I tell you, they're not like war. And the war reporters, it is quite interesting, you gradually realise a lot of these war correspondents, I've come to realise, they are reactors, but they're not analysts. And they repeat themselves, if you think about it, like watch a lot of the 24-hour news coverage. But I want to know more. I want to know what they can see, but I can't. They're often talking over footage. I can see the footage. I want to know what then they're saying that Lee Doucette from the BBC, she does it extremely well, Canadian woman. But that's a very long way of answering you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. Stephen Mudd from New South Wales Farmers, and as a former journo myself, I find myself watching those things, and I was a snoopy little kid. I kind of want to look around the corner of what the camera's looking at and see what else is there. My question though is, given that there's so much noise in the world, what is the future for public interest journalism when the public's no longer interested?
Very good question, nicely put. Well, that's what we're all trying to think about. We're all truly wrestling with hugely, and that's exactly what I tried to wrestle with in the Andrew Olley lecture. Because I knew that probably there were whole strands of them who wanted me to sort of argue against AI and, all the people who are trying to traduce us, etc. But it seems to me that question is it. That's the essence of it. And look, there is an argument that, strangely enough, public interest journalism, which is funded by, the taxpayers in various places, might indeed come through this better than others, that it's actually big journalism that's funded by other than philanthropic funds, like The Guardian, is funded by that philanthropic trust. But so many of the others, they're the ones who are struggling. Subscriptions are undoubtedly helping people, and Rupert did that, introduced that paywall idea. I think that public interest journalism does actually have a chance to name the beast well. I think what we've got to do is get away from just reactivity. So I think the 24-hour news agenda is becoming a major problem, I've decided, because it doesn't encourage creativity, it encourages repetitiveness. And I think a lot of us are just being turned off. And somehow or other, we've got to draw people back in ways that are inviting but tangential to that main agenda, which is, to me, that's good old angle getting. Like, nobody talks about that these days. The business of getting an angle. What angle? What angle are you going for? Oh, well, the Israelis have opened fire in Gaza. Yes, I know that, but what angle are you going to do? Oh, it hasn't been. Nobody's asked them that, Or I say to, with Global Roaming, I say, what's he going to say? And a couple of them say, what do you mean, what's he going to say? I said, well, there are loads of people who can tell us, just enumerate. I can do that. I want somebody who gives me something. Now, I think that is going to have to grow. And there's still quite a lot of evidence that the legacy media still has a great deal of clout. In fact, one of the things that Phil Coorey from the Fin says in this, he was one of the judges of this, influence, fame and influence in Australia. If it weren't for people like us breaking news, the influencers would have nothing to talk about, says Phil. I thought, yes, that's a totally fair comment, I think, because they don't go out and collect the material. We've got to believe in ourselves having the right to offer that is fresh and different. Look, I think it's coming. I think the podcast world has definitely helped. But as you know, there's also a great deal of interest in, particularly among young men, among the sort of Joe Rogan type, 3-hour-long sort of talk as you go, no discipline, no, sort of just let it go. Now, I just can't stand that. But that has definitely got a hold on some people. Now, that is creative, but is it going to hold in the long run? I doubt it. Thank you.
Geraldine, Andrew Marshall from the Land newspaper, or ACM. Robert, the truth answer to your question is read the Land newspaper every week.
I don't have a subscription, so I can't.
That's a big problem. We can talk about that later. Geraldine, I don't know how I'm going to phrase this question because it sort of dates me back to your early days on the ABC, and I don't want it to be coming out the wrong way, but my feeling as a young journalist then, and as we sort of discussed earlier, I was pretty much in my cadet days when you were big on TV, but there was only you and maybe Jana Vint as female journalists. I don't want to sort of make any sort of comments about just generally how the industry's changed, although, the Land newspaper probably had one journalist in those days as well, but one female journalist. And I'm just sort of thinking you were a lot more fun than the anchors on the 7:30 report these days, or, you look at, they're nice people, and Lee Sales and Sarah Ferguson really do take themselves rather seriously, I feel. I just felt there were, I'm wondering whether there's a case here where girls have taken these great positions and are really good at their jobs, but it has to be so serious. And I even back to, it doesn't have to be females. I can even remember Bill Peach running TDT. So it was a much smilier opportunity when they came around, and I'm just sort of wondering whether we've got to the situation now where news is seen to be that sort of presentation news is seen to be very serious, and you have to be frowning and whereas I remember you as being a smiley sort of person when appropriate, and and well loved.
You get that to disarm the baguettes. It's off the smiling assassin.
Look, I say to my children, charm never hurt anyone. Charm has got me a long way. You want to work on charm, it's amazing. Charm's false. Oh, well, I advise you to think about it. But I think it does very well. Look, that's a very interesting question, which I can't go into specific character analyses of various people. Were we allowed to be more frivolous? Look, I think as women, as women had to be taken as people of gravitas. That was a part of it all, that you had to learn that, there were men like the Paul Lynhams of this world. Andrew Olley was a very charming man who could certainly send himself up, if you think about it. I was looking at, I don't know whether many of you saw the wonderful Max Utrich story of PNG independence. The other was on ABC last week, and it's on iView now. It's a sort of a marvellous cavalcade of the ABC archive going right back to Ken Begg, Jim Downs, Michael Charlton, from who was very much went and dominated the BBC. He had a particular voice which we all knew about. Now these were men of big, I know it sounds ridiculous, but I'm serious, big deep voices. So a major perceived problem was women's voices. That is still, I still have women coming up. My voice has deepened over the years, actually. I don't even think about my voice now, but I took lessons from Arch McCurdy when I joined radio from television, and Arch McCurdy used to do that one, I don't know whether many of you remember, he did a wonderful jazz show, and he was also an excellent voice tutor. But women still, young women come up to me, it really distresses me, and they say, would you mind giving me some advice, please? Now, I take giving advice about people's voices so seriously. It's like looking into their soul. Like you muck around with people's voice and you wreck people's presentation. And you've got to go where people are. I had one woman who came up to me who used to do lovely little docos, voice docos and things. When she was speaking to people, interviewing people, she had a lovely modulated, easy voice. When she did the voiceover, and when she had to put it together, she went all deep, she tried to go deep, she couldn't go deep, but all on a monotone. It was dreadful. She was trying to be Andrew Olley, And I said to her, I want you to go and listen to yourself. When you hear your voice, in a lovely voice, you're natural speaking to people, because women are very good speaking to people, And I said, that's your voice. That is your voice. I want you to recreate that. Now, this is just a small story, but, you know, that was the sort of thing that bedeviled women as to whether we really felt watched. And I'm sure that's still the case with Sarah Ferguson and Lee Sales. And, you know, you do that main 7:30 report program, oh, watch out. You know, I had to stop looking years ago when I had to stop looking at the list of viewer responses. Some of them were dead set misogynistic. You know, I remember one person thankfully said to me, if that were racially designed, that would be outright racism. And that helped me so much. I couldn't believe how much it helped me. I thought, oh yes, that's absolutely right. This is completely misogynistic. Or as one very good man said to me, which I think may be the way to answer you, he was a very good producer. He was completely on my side and I knew it. And in the middle of Gulf War I, where it got very heated and so on, certainly did. And, the viewers piled in and had a massive go at me. And the pro-Israel lobby had a massive go at me and everything. And it was pretty full on. David Hill was the MD. And Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, worried like hell about Israel. So it was all full on. This man, my producer, said to me, just pull your personality back 10% and you'll be fine. Now, it was an incredible thing for him to say because I could have taken great offence at that and said, how dare you speak to me like that, you know? Are you going to say the same thing to Andrew Olley? But I knew this man was on my side and I took that on board and I've never looked back, more or less. And I said that recently at a lunch in Melbourne, a big women's lunch, and I had about 7 women come up to me and say, thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. Because my point was, if they had said to me, pull your personality back 50%, I would have been offended. I was like, well, on me. But 10%, that was easy. I could fiddle with it. So, I don't know. It's not easy being women in those public eye still.
Thank you, Kathleen Curry, Head of Comms and a former journalist myself. I'm interested in your thoughts around social cohesion, and we're sort of seeing in certain Western countries this sort of breakdown in social cohesion. Would love your thoughts on the role journalists play in trying to, or should they be trying to keep that in mind with their reporting?
Well, I think they should be. I think there should be a conscious sense of that runs beneath you and the editors too, that you don't play around with this. You know, one of the things in the reports of Charlie Kirk, we were talking about at the table earlier, that absolute tragedy, there he was involved in the art of persuasion, the great need. But honestly, some of his words I just think should never be uttered in a pluralist society, or uttered with great care, always balanced, and consciously sort of aware of the downside possibility of applying this. I mean, I really, to me, it's akin to, shouting fire in a full cinema and really being irresponsible. I do find the buy-in of certain outlets just almost rev it up. I think it's absolutely reprehensible. I don't understand it. I just don't understand it. All I can imagine is that for a lot of people, they've never lived in a society where social cohesion becomes a major issue. My father grew up in Kalgoorlie. His father was a policeman, a very famous policeman actually. My grandfather, I never met him. But Dad was there during the riots, the Italian Yugoslav riots in the 30s, and they're not right. They were very nasty indeed in the 1930s. People who know history know about it. And Dad said to me, in race riots, you can't hide. You are who you are, and therefore it's really full on. Now, I've just never forgotten that, and I just think we all ought to be extremely cautious about this. But you can't censor. You've got to find a way to let people have their say. But another sort of example of what helped me think this through, I lived in England between 74 and 78 when the the IRA was full on. This is before the Tony Blair solution. And the BBC had this real debate on, did they give a platform to the men of violence? And after a great deal of discussion, they said, yes, we will give them a platform, but they mustn't advocate violence on our platform. So we'll hear them mount arguments that are very troubling, but we will not be the platform for you saying, I invite you to join me as we take on so-and-so. Now, I've always found that quite a useful help, so that you hear things that are horrible, but you mustn't be the way in which you become the avenue for advocacy. To me, that could be applied. Is it still being applied? I mean, God knows what they're going through in those American newsrooms. That's all I can say. I don't know how they're... I don't know whether you've heard, we've interviewed Jonathan Swan, who works for the New York Times, Norman Swan's son, who won a Pulitzer Prize for that interview that he did with Donald Trump after the his first time in power. And, you know, Jonathan is in there, right in there, and I just wonder what it's like at the moment, because it's getting pretty hairy over there, I think. And I don't know... I'm interviewing 2 people on Tuesday who are coming out for the Lowy Institute, that they do that big award of theirs. And this is Peter Baker and Susan, I've forgotten her surname, his wife, who works now, I think, for Politico. He's a long-time New York Times man. And they're coming out, and I'm interviewing them on Tuesday. It'll be on Global Roaming next week. And I'm really, both of them, they were here a few years back. And when it was Trump's first term, and they were in agony then, saying every morning you got up, and they were husband and wife, and he'd be the one to turn on to find out if Trump had said something ridiculous, and she'd say, "What's he said today?" And then they had to go and report it. Well, it's much more now.
My morning routine. Daryl, I wonder if we...
Thank you very much, Geraldine, for being so generous in your time. I would now invite Daryl Anderson from Anvil Media to you a vote formal thanks.
Hasn't that been excellent to hear from Geraldine? I think we've all got lots of memories of observing Geraldine's career during our lives. I had a particular interest today. I mean, Anvil Media's business is built on the skills that most of us learned as journalism, and applying that to paying clients. So we're not journalists anymore. We make stuff for people who pay us to do stuff. But I have a particular personal interest in hearing about your career, Geraldine, in that my daughter is in her first year with the ABC as a cadet. She's about to move to Townsville to take up a real journalism role there. So it was great both as an observer of your career and as a lover of journalism, of public interest journalism, that gatekeeper role that you described so well. It was great to hear your clarity around maintaining a clear distinction between activism and journalism, and the critical role of legacy journalism, and as gatekeepers. Thought it was interesting that idea that you quoted about people choosing their own echo chambers, and I think in some ways the algorithm causes the echo chamber to choose them by the choices they make. So there's that whole feedback loop that who's doing the choosing? Are you choosing the echo chamber, or is the algorithm choosing you? It was interesting to hear you talk about kicking off as recently as 2023 the global roaming program, I think it was, that you referred to. And it's wonderful to hear that so deep into such an extraordinary career that you're still doing new things, still looking for the gap in what's not what's not yet being done and contributing to new ways to address them. And that, I think that speaks volumes about the value that your career has brought to Australian journalism, Australian public interest journalism. My hope is that as a consumer of journalism and as one watching the career of a young journalist just entering the beginning of that career, is that public interest journalism remains valued to the extent that there are still opportunities to innovate while taking seriously that role of gatekeeper. Geraldine, thanks so much for your generosity and thoughtfulness in presenting to New South Wales farm riders today, and I ask the room to express our appreciation to you.